April 15th, 1277. Baybars stood on a slope overlooking the plain of Elbistan. The ground, as far as the eye could see, was littered with the bodies of thousands of dead Mongols. The Battle of Elbistan was over, and once again Baybars and his mighty Mamluk army were victorious. His invasion of Mongol-held Anatolia was going as planned. He had annihilated the main Mongol army in the region, and his march on the Seljuk capital, Caesarea, was now unopposed. This was another triumph to add to the many others that had accumulated throughout the career of this warrior sultan. He was the hero of Ain Jalut. He defeated all Mongol attacks on his domains. He conquered much of the Crusader states and reduced them to insignificance, and launched an offensive campaign into the Mongol-occupied region of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Baybars had plans for the future, but these never materialized because he would be dead months after his victory at Elbistan. Baybars I is one of the most famous and illustrious among the rulers of the Mamluk Sultanate. However, Baybars was not born into royalty. He was enslaved at a young age and sold to the Ayyubid rulers of Syria and Egypt. Torn away from his home and family, he had to strive to survive in a foreign land. He distinguished himself as a soldier in the service of his masters and ascended the ranks of the Ayyubid military. He played a major role in the overthrow of the last Ayyubid Sultan in 1250 and seized the throne from another Mamluk Sultan a decade later and reigned for 17 years. This is his story. And we bring this to you alongside a great many other stories, the stories of those who lived in Egypt thousands of years earlier, from our sponsor Magellan TV, the hidden gem of documentary streaming services. They feature the hidden history of Egypt with Terry Jones, in which the star of Monty Python fame adventures through Egypt, not to learn the usual history of the rich rulers, but the hidden history of the lives everyone else lived. A passing glance at media on ancient Egypt might lead one to believe it was a nightmare land of tyrant nobles working slaves to death in a constant barrage of misery and evil. Well, that might make for good movies, but with the help of Egyptologists, Terry will take you on a journey to see that really it was quite different, and the impressions we get of ancient Egypt are mistakenly caused by various quirks and illusions of the historical record. Instead, he'll be sampling the foods, fashions, and frolics of the real ancient Egyptians, tell you what really happened back then, and how historians have managed to dig through the myths to discover all this hidden history. And of course there are loads of other history titles to watch on Magellan TV, and loads of genres aside from history, so we can highly recommend it as an endless source of new content to enjoy. Even better, try it for free for a whole month to watch the hidden history of Egypt and more via our special link in the description. Baybars was born in the Kipchak steppe between 1220 and 1229. Into one of the Kipchak tribes inhabiting this region. The Kipchaks, referred to as Cumans in Europe and Polovtsi by the Russians, were a confederation of pagan nomadic Turkic tribes that inhabited the steppes of southern Russia and Ukraine. They were renowned for their military prowess and skills, and served as mercenaries or slave soldiers in the armies of both Muslim and Christian kingdoms and empires. Baybars' tribe fled westward in the wake of the Mongol invasions of the 1220s and 1230s, and sought refuge in the Crimean Peninsula, which was then controlled by a Turkmen tribal chief, Anas Khan. Feeling secure, the refugees let their guard down, only to be treacherously attacked by Anas Khan. Many of them were killed and enslaved. Baybars was among the young captives who were transported by way of Sivas in Anatolia to the slave markets of Ayyubid Syria. Little is known about the details of Baybars' journey to the Middle East, his education, and his training. However, one can reconstruct the process based on the descriptions given in the many chronicles, biographical dictionaries, and martial arts manuals that survive from the Mamluk period. Mamluks were treated much differently than other slaves. these boys were destined to become elite soldiers, officers, governors, and members of the ruler's court. They established strong relationships with their patrons and underwent some formal education and training in the martial and equestrian arts. The slaves were freed at the end of their training and enrolled in the Sultan's army or the retinue of an emir as professional full-time soldiers and were paid from the treasury. These Mamluk soldiers were elite heavy cavalrymen who fought both as shock cavalry and mounted archers. They excelled at close combat using the lance and other melee weapons such as swords, maces, and axes, and could deal death from a distance firing their composite bows from horseback, making them some of the most versatile warriors of the Middle Ages. This versatility allowed them to successfully fight nomadic armies composed primarily of mounted archers, such as those fielded by the Mongols, and to fight on equal terms with heavier foes, such as the Frankish knights of the Crusader states, and the heavy cavalrymen fielded by the Kingdom of Georgia and the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. The sources do not tell us what Baybars looked like as a youth, but later descriptions state that he was tall, swarthy, had a powerful voice, and blue eyes, one of which had a tiny white spot. He was first sold to someone by the name of Imad al-Din al-Sa'i for the low price of 800 dirhams. He was promptly returned to the merchant due to the white spot in his eye. Baybars was then taken to Hama, where the local ruler, al-Malik al-Mansur Muhammad, almost purchased him. However, his mother convinced him not to buy Baybars because there was something evil in his eye. He was eventually purchased by an emir, Ala al-Din Aydakin al-Salihi al-Bundukdar, an officer in the army of al-Salih Ayyub, the future Sultan of Egypt. Aydakin, who was already on shaky terms with his overlord, incurred al-Salih's anger when he married another emir's concubine. The Sultan banished him and confiscated his property, including his Mamluks. This is how Baybars came to pass into the service of al-Salih Ayyub. He would eventually join his elite regiment, the Bariya. Baybars was able to quickly distinguish himself through his prowess, intelligence, and leadership qualities. He was promoted and rewarded by his master until he was one of the leading officers in the regiment. In 1239, al-Salih Ayyub made a bid for the Egyptian throne after the death of his father, al-Kamil. He occupied Damascus and invaded Egypt. His army was reportedly 6,000 strong and composed of tribesmen and mercenaries, mostly Turkmens, Kurds, and Khwarezmians, in addition to al-Salih's guard of Mamluks. Most of his troops deserted him, leaving him with loyal Mamluks. He was imprisoned by his cousin in Kerak for 6 months. During his incarceration, a slave, also named Baybars, often conflated with the future sultan, shared his cell, along with his favorite concubine Shuja al-Dur, also a Kipchak Turk. Al-Salih's other Mamluks remained waiting outside Kerak either for their master's release or the opportunity to rescue him. Al-Salih was released from prison in 1240 and seized the Sultanate. Based on his experiences, he started purchasing Mamluks in large numbers and based his power on these loyal and elite soldiers. He created several regiments, of which the Bariya and the Jamdariya were the most powerful and elite. As an officer of the Bariya regiment, Baybars and his comrades were in close association with their patron, and many of them held some of the most important positions at the royal court. Baybars was also a veteran of many battles prior to his rise to the throne. He may have been at the Battle of Gaza or Laforbi in 1244, where al-Salih Ayyub and his Mamluks and Khwarezmian allies inflicted a crushing defeat on the allied army of the Crusader states and the Ayyubids of Syria. Al-Salih then defeated the Khwarezmians, who had rebelled against him in 1246 in a battle near Homs. The sources do not explicitly mention if Baybars was there. It was at the Battle of Mansoura in 1250 that Baybars really distinguished himself. Baybars was effectively in command of the Bariya during this battle. The Sultan had died from medical complications during the campaign. The Bariya regiment's commander, Faris al-Din Aktay, was dispatched to Hisn Kaifa to bring back Al-Salih's heir, Turan Shah. Initially, it seemed as though the Battle of Mansoura would be a Crusader victory. Robert of Artois and a contingent of knights forded the Ashmam Canal at a lightly guarded point with the help of a Bedouin guide. He launched a surprise attack on the Egyptian military camp, which was about 2 to 3 miles away from Mansoura, forcing most of the forces that were stationed there to withdraw and killing Fakhr al-Din, the commander of the army. The Crusaders then proceeded to enter Mansoura through gates that had been left open. Baybars and the Bariya rallied the other retreating units and restored order and stationed them at various points in the city. Robert and his men advanced deep into Mansoura, all the while suffering attacks from the alleys and the rooftops. When they got to the palace, they were met by the Bariya, arrayed in battle formation. The heavily armored Mamluks were more than a match for the attacking Crusaders. Robert of Artois died in the fighting, along with hundreds of knights. Shortly after the debacle at Mansoura, Louis IX and the remainder of his army attempted to withdraw to Damietta. About 2 months after the battle, the Crusaders suffered another devastating defeat at the Battle of Farisker on April 6th. By this time, Turan Shah had arrived to take command of the Egyptian army. The Crusader army was destroyed. Those soldiers and knights who were not killed were taken prisoner, along with the king. Turan Shah did not reign long. He despised the Bariya for their power and influence in Egypt, and sought to replace them with his own Mamluks and supporters. He even threatened to execute their leaders and to confiscate their property and wealth. The Bariya did not wait and struck preemptively. They attacked him in his camp, and a Mamluk injured the Sultan's hand with his sword. Turan Shah fled to a wooden tower near the Nile. The Mamluks set fire to the tower, forcing him out. Turan Shah attempted to make a run for the river, but was wounded by a spear thrust to the ribs. He made it to the water, but his pursuers were close behind and fired arrows at him from the riverbank. Some accounts state it was Baybars himself who waded into the river to deal the killing blow to the hapless monarch as he begged for his life. Turan Shah's assassination ushered in a decade of chaos in Egypt. Initially, the Bariya raised Shaja al-Dur as the Sultana. However, a female on the throne of Egypt did not sit well with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Izz al-Din Aybak, an officer of middling rank, was raised to the position of Atabak and Sultan, only to be replaced 5 days later by Al-Ashraf Musa, a 6-year-old scion of the House of Ayyub. Al-Ashraf was the titular Sultan of Egypt until 1254, with Aybak as the regent and true power behind the throne. During this time, Baybars supported his commanding officer Aktay in furthering his interests and those of his fellow Bariya. In 1250, shortly after the victory at Mansoura, the Bedouin tribes of Upper Egypt revolted. They refused to be the subjects of slaves. Baybars was sent with a force of 200 Mamluks to crush the rebellion. The underaged Al-Ashraf was deposed only months after being raised to the throne. That same year, Aktay was invited to the citadel by Aybak and treacherously murdered. When their leader failed to return, the Bariya went to the citadel only to have Aktay's head flung over the wall at them. Many of the Bariya, about 700 to 800 in number, fled to Syria under the leadership of Baybars. They served the Ayyubid princes, Al-Mughith of Kerak and then Al-Nasir Yusuf of Damascus, as mercenaries. In 1257, Aybak was murdered by Shaja al-Dur. Having lost the support of all the Mamluk factions, she was in turn killed by a group of Aybak's concubines. Al-Mu'iz, Aybak's 15-year-old son, was raised to the throne, but it was his lieutenant Qutuz who held the real reins of power. In 1259, Qutuz seized the Sultanate for himself, using the need for a strong leader against the Mongol invasion as his excuse. In the meantime, Baybars had led 2 invasions of Egypt in 1257 and 1258. Despite failing both times, Baybars and his comrades distinguished themselves against superior numbers. In 1260, Baybars made his peace with Qutuz. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, Baybars led the vanguard against the Mongols. Once again, he and the Bariya distinguished themselves and were an important element that secured the defeat of the Mongol forces. Baybars and a group of emirs managed to isolate Qutuz on the return journey to Cairo and murdered him. It was once again Baybars who struck the killing blow. Baybars was proclaimed the new sultan by his followers, and the entire army followed suit. Baybars spent his entire reign, 1260 to 1277, strengthening the Mamluk army and preparing for another inevitable Mongol invasion. During his reign, the regular army increased significantly. The regular army of Egypt under the Ayyubids had numbered 10 to 12,000 horsemen. Baybars increased it to 30 to 40,000 professional soldiers. Baybars also recruited Turkmen, Bedouin and Kurdish tribal auxiliaries. He also established an effective spy network that alerted him of any impending Mongol attacks. Baybars ensured the army was always in a state of readiness. He held frequent military reviews to make sure the soldiers all maintained their equipment and were combat ready. Baybars also continued the struggle with what was left of the Crusader states. He besieged and conquered Caesarea, Arsuf, Safed, Jaffa, Antioch, and the Crac de Chevalier. He weakened them so much that his successors, Calawin and his son Al-Ashraf Khalil, easily finished them off, conquering their last two major strongholds, Tripoli and Acre. All throughout his campaigns, Baybars actively participated in both planning and personally leading and fighting in the battles and sieges. Baybars' last campaign took place in 1277. He invaded Anatolia, ruled by the Seljuks of Rum, who were vassals of the Mongols. At the Battle of Elbistan, he fought the main Mongol army in the region. Both armies numbered around 10 to 15,000 men. The Mongols deployed 1 Tumen along with around 3,000 Georgian vassal troops and some Seljuk auxiliaries. The Mongol army was crushed in the battle. The Mamluk soldiers' more accurate and longer-range archery, their heavy armor, their superior training, and their larger and stronger war horses all contributed to the outcome of the battle, in which 6 to 10,000 Mongols and Georgians were killed, as opposed to a relatively small number of Mamluks. Baybars occupied the Seljuk capital of Kayseri and had himself proclaimed Sultan, and struck coins in his name. Baybars did not live long to bask in his glory or to carry out any of his future plans. He died in Syria that same year on his return journey to Cairo. There are several speculations regarding his death. He may have consumed poisoned kumis. He may have died of a wound he sustained in battle, or he may have succumbed to an illness. At the time of his death, Baybars left a stable sultanate with a strong army that was ready for the next major Mongol invasion. He laid down the model for the organization of the army and its training, which was followed for generations after his death. Baybars' story is exemplary of the careers of many slave soldiers of the medieval and early modern Muslim world. He rose from being a refugee and slave to become a soldier, officer, and then a ruler. Most of the most successful rulers of the Mamluk Sultanate started their careers as slaves and soldiers, just like Baybars. Even though not every slave soldier became a sultan, many of them became officers, administrators, and governors. The Mamluks, even the rank and file, enjoyed a special status in society and had the opportunity to rise to wealth and power through merit at a time when climbing the social ladder was not very common among the freeborn peoples of both European Christendom and the Muslim world. More videos on the history of Islam are on the way, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps us immensely.